So this is not a divine service, clearly. The candles aren't lit. So the only reason I say that is if you have questions, please ask them. And I'll try to answer them as best we can. So we were going to do a rotation back to one of our very first Lenten journeys through the footsteps of Christ. But after the Lent 101, many of you came up and said, I want to know more about the church history. Or I didn't know anything about that with church history. Or that was fascinating about church history. So I pivoted a bit. And so this Lenten season, we're going to learn church history. I think that's important. Now, to be fair, especially to the two pastors here, this is not going to be seminary in depth. I have picked and plucked what I think is necessary to know for being apologetic and knowing your faith and knowing what we are and why we are. And so while we're not going to cover each of the minute details or talk about all the councils, we will talk about the very important ones and the very things that end up bringing us to where we are today. And as like I said, while we go through this, if you have any questions, please let me know, or you want clarification, please let me know. So we're going to start with when the church began. Now, that's somewhat of a trick question, and I'll tell you why. Because a lot of times when people say, where does the Christian church begin, the whomever, and I'm guilty of it as well, because we typically start at the apostolic church, the resurrection of Christ, but that cannot be further from the truth. The church began at the beginning of the world, day one. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? And so we can trace our history, religious history, the religion of Christianity, because our roots are that of Judaism, or Jewish roots, to the very oldest religion. Now, there's one faction that will debate that. There's another God that, in the very first earliest forms of writing that we know it, going back to the Rosetta Stone kind of stuff, when we talk about the very first early recordings, we see two kind of demigods, one that shall not be named, that's the God that we have followed through history, or Yahweh. And then we see another one, the very earliest being Marduk. Marduk was a pagan god, the beginning of the pagan gods. But if you follow the Marduk lineage, it will end up, and again, this is not to be adversarial, it is what it is. It ends up being Baal, ends up going to the lineage of what you see Islam today. So, they can trace back pretty far too, but to a pagan god called Marduk. So there's two initial gods. The Hebrew God, these are the earliest forms of theo that we find, of a God that is worshipped. Those are the very earliest forms that we find. So when someone says about Christianity, something to the effect of the church began here, or your religion is 2,000 years old, that's not true. In fact, we are the completion of the Jewish faith, right? We are the Jewish faith. We're just the completion of it. Our ancestry runs through the Jewish lineage, which is why we hold the Old Testament, which is why you know about Moses and Noah, and why we talk about King David, because these are all very important to us as well. They're the beginnings of our foundations of our faith, and because they all point towards the Messiah, right? The Messianic prophecies is the Old Testament. The Old Testament is made up of the Messianic prophecies, which we know point to Christ, to Jesus. So Jesus, through the New Testament we call it, is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. The two together create the fulfillment of Judaism. So, when did we start? Well, we started in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's when we start, okay? We are the oldest known religion in the world, but people will try to get very cute with you, especially when they're talking to you or trying to debate you, and they'll try to tell you how you're not. Well, that's not true, and we'll show you that as we go. Now, as far as our church Christian history, which is what we're going to focus on, right? We're going to talk a little bit about the Jews starting next week, and where we get some stuff, but we're going to focus specifically on the Christian church itself, from the resurrection of Christ to today. So we can see in our little early church chart here, this was the early growing pains of the Christian church. The apostolic church actually stops about right here. So when people talk about the apostolic church, it stops about right there, and then you have the early church. And I want to explain what the apostolic church was, because you're hearing that more and more and more. That's a good thing. The apostolic church was the church where members still had interaction, or people knew someone who had interaction with Jesus. So the apostolic church, when Paul is writing to Corinth, that's the apostolic church, right? When they're getting stuff from the disciples, that's the apostolic church. People who had firsthand account of Jesus is the apostolic church. After that becomes what we call the early church period, and we're going to follow that all the way until really we get to the Edict of Religious Tolerance, or Constantine. We'll talk about that in a moment. So this first 300 years was a rough time to be a Christian, obviously. We're going to talk more about that, but for the most part, because it was outlawed by Rome, and because Christians were persecuted, right? That we see that through the Gospels, and then in Acts, even Saul, who becomes Paul, is a persecutor of Christians. He goes to kill Christians. So that's a pretty known thing. And now I can't find my notes. They're probably back there somewhere. Is this professional or what? Let me check in the back real quick before I forget something. See? That's why you guys gave me a raises here, right there. I appreciate that. So we have the apostolic church going into the early church. So the apostolic church is a pretty robust, amazing time for a couple of reasons. One, Jesus gives the gifts to the apostles, right? And so before we go any further, there's only so many apostles. The apostles are anointed by Christ. Even in Revelation, it tells us that there is no more apostles. And so, again, when you see these churches and they say, I'm apostle so-and-so, they're not. They're not apostles. Anything, the apostles have come and gone. That was a period that is no longer with us. And then also, I would say to those who want to debate the gifts of the Spirit, Jesus puts a very finite understanding on that. He gives certain gifts to people specifically, then the other gifts are different. And so, again, a Benny Hinn cannot heal you, no matter how much he thinks he can. The gift of tongues is not needed because I have an iPhone, and I'm not trying to upset anyone. It just is what it is. I don't have to go to Singapore and worry about translation, and I don't have to do that. And so these are things that the apostolic church had, we don't have, and there's a couple reasons for that. Now that is very scriptural. The same as when the disciples come off of Mount Tabor, what happened to their faces? They glowed, right? What happened to Moses when he comes off the mountain? It glowed. There's something that happens when you're in the presence of God that doesn't happen when you're not. Okay, and we need to be okay with that. And so when people say stuff like, well, I want to have the gifts of the apostolic church of the apostles, that's not possible at this moment. Theologically, it's just not. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, the apostolic church booms because the disciples and the apostles are going and doing amazing things all over the world. Very much so. Paul is giving very sound teaching, and I'll show you in a minute the breakup of those two. Paul's giving sound teaching, and the church is booming. Now, the church booms here, I would say, more than any other time in the world. But if you look at history, they're going to tell you that the church really booms at 300 on. I don't think that's true, and I'll explain why in a minute. The church booms here and then steadily grows, as we go. So for the first 300 years, Christianity is illegal, completely illegal. Now, there are phases up and down that Rome actually enforces that, hunts down Christians. There are 60 or 70-year periods, and then you'll have a period of somewhat peace, because what you'll find is that Caesar comes into power that really doesn't care, that really is kind of not a war Caesar, as it were, doesn't care, and so you'll see kind of peace and prosperity. And then you'll see another Caesar come in, and they'll use the Christians for a scapegoat. What happens in this first 300 years is, whenever something comes up, though, the Christians are always blamed, right? It's very easy to blame the Christians. And funny enough, Nero, who we know kind of mostly is the Caesar that's really the roughest on the Christians, Nero's the one that really kills most of the people that you and I hold very near and dear to our hearts in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And he's the one that first really puts the Christians in the Colosseum, feeds them to the lions, that sort of thing. Nero actually uses the claim against Christians. The claim that they were killed under was that they were atheists, because they believed in a singular God, and that couldn't be. They didn't believe in a pluralism of gods. They didn't believe in Zeus and all these different gods, the god of love, the god of this, the god of that. And so because of that, they were clearly atheists. They didn't believe in the true God, who was Caesar, right? So they were atheists. So they were killed, oddly enough, because they were told they did not actually believe in God. Atheism is what ended up killing most Christians. Well, at least the charge against them. So we see this, kind of the church actually goes until 251. We start to see the very first beginnings of, I don't want to say organization, but in a sense, yes. And we have someone by the name of Anthony in Egypt. Anthony in Egypt is the first one who goes and says, I'm getting away from the world. The world's crazy. I'm going to go into a cave in the desert, and I'm going to completely give myself to God. I'm going to completely give myself to him. And what I'm going to do, Anthony said, is I'm going to create these writings. Some were of Paul, some were of the disciples. We didn't have the canon at the time. There wasn't the Bible. So we had some letters. We had some of the first Gospels. And he said, I'm going to write as many of these as I can, and I want to get them out. And he kind of becomes the very first monk as we know it. Some would say he's kind of the first clergy as well. But the monastery orders kind of come from that. The monks kind of come from that. And they start from that tradition to this, really, they don't have to do it anymore, but up until a couple hundred years ago, really, their sole job in life for 1,000 years was to rewrite the Bible and to illustrate the Bible. Beautiful transcripts that they made to give out. And so a church at the time may have one Bible, and it would have been handwritten by these monks. So that's kind of the first, we start to see an organization. Now before that, people are going to tell you, and this is the one I love the most, well, the very apostolic church met in homes and houses. So we should meet in homes and houses. You shouldn't have a big church that's greedy. The apostolic church met in homes and houses. That's not true. So when people say that, that's not true at all. There's a couple of reasons why they didn't meet necessarily in their own churches. Number one, as we talked about, Christianity is illegal. So the number one thing to get killed would have been to build a big old church and say, here we are. So that wouldn't have been. Two, the Christians, for the first 200 years, really, they worshipped in the synagogues because they were what we called Messianic Jews. They were still Jewish until the pagan ranks the Gentile ranks started to outrun the Jewish ranks. And then what happened was Rome started taxing the Jews, and so the Jews said, wait, these Christians are meeting in our synagogues too, and they're not paying any taxes. And so eventually, in about 200 years after the death of Christ, the Jews kicked the Christians out of the synagogues. But until then, they meet and worship in the synagogues. They still met and worshiped in places of worship. Now, there's a period there of about 100 years in which it's kind of difficult You have the Jews really being forced into labor camps, as it were, in a sense, building Roman roads. And the Jews at the time occupied Jerusalem. From that time until we really see the first jihad, and then around 900, and you see the crusade after that, there's about almost 1,000 years that Jerusalem, the city, is a Christian city. Christians hold Jerusalem longer than any other religion. People don't realize that. The Jews, King David, takes the city a few hundred years before Christ, right? We know that he takes it. And then so that we see that kind of, now we can say, well, the Jews had it even further back than that. Well, at that point, I would say it's not a city. It was a hill that Abraham was on with his child. It wasn't a city at the time. We're talking about the city. Really and truly, Christians have held the city longer than anyone else. Even today, in the four quarters of Jerusalem, the old city, two of those quarters are Christian quarters. The Armenian and the Christian. Then you have the Jewish and you have the Muslim. So really, from kind of 70 AD, when Rome knocks down the temple and kicks the Jews out, from that point forward, Christians have, for the most part, with the exception of some years here and there during kind of Jihad Crusade, have held the majority of Jerusalem ever since. So these are some misconceptions that you probably have heard as well. Because people often like to tell you, well, Christians have the least amount of, I would say, stance for Jerusalem. That's not true. That's not true at all. In fact, when the Muslims first came into Jerusalem, the Christians welcomed them to come and worship in the church with the church through the crucifixion, the Holy Sepulchre, invited them into the Holy Sepulchre to worship because they remembered a time in which they didn't have churches in order to worship in, and they said, come and worship. Come and worship. Now the Jews said, the Muslims said, we don't feel comfortable. We want to go worship on this hill, which at the time was kind of the worn out temple mount. And the Christians said, of course. And in fact, the very first mosque that you see is still there today, the mosque on the dome on the rock that you see, that mosque was built by Syrian Christians. There wasn't Muslims in the area. They didn't have the tools. So they paid the Syrian Christians to build that mosque, which is why you see those rich colors, the blues, the very Christian colors, which you don't see at most other mosques, covering and adorning it. And they built it in the fashion of the first Christian churches, in this octagon kind of pattern. Now, Christian churches changed a bit from that and went more cathedral, and basilica, but Muslim churches, other than that one, do not look like that. Why? Because it was built by the early Syrian Christians. So here's some little tidbits that you probably didn't know, or that were distorted to you because people try to distort history to make it suit them. The truth is, the Jewish faith all the way through to the Christian faith is one continual understanding of God. From Abraham on, the Old Testament points to Christ, and from Christ on to Revelation is what the church has now become. A little splintered, but it's now what we've become. So I'm going to come off of this here, and we'll look at some different things. But I want to show you kind of this timeline, very difficult period for Christians. Then we have the Edict of Religious Tolerance. That does not mean Christianity becomes the official Christian or religion of Rome at this point, but it is allowed to be legal. And at that point, almost half of the world stands up and says, we're Christian. We've been catechumed and baptized. We've just been under the radar for this long. We're actually Christian. And at that point, that's when Constantine says, even his own mother says, I'm a Christian. As soon as he makes it legal, and he makes it legal for a reason I'll tell you in a minute, but as soon as he makes it legal, almost half the world stands up and says we're Christian. Because during this period of time, when it was the most dangerous, the church was growing like it had never grown before or after. It was spreading. Slaves were becoming Christians. Why? Well, eventually, one of the very first Roman bishops started out as a slave. It was a religion that all people could come to, with a salvation that was different than anything anyone had ever heard of, and a Messiah who cared about the individual and not necessarily what the individual could give. It was very different. So from there we see the Council of Nicaea, which is where we get the Nicene Creed, and so forth and so forth. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But I want to switch over to this map. So the spread of Christianity. Now, a lot of people will say Christianity spreads, for the most part, because Rome pushes it on people. But that's not exactly true. But this map shows a little bit. So by the time of Constantine, 325, is when Christianity becomes the official religion of Rome. The time of Irenaeus in 185 AD, this is still a very bad black time for Christians. This is really one of the most heinous times for Christians. They get scapegoated for a fire that happens in Jerusalem, and so Christians are really hunted down and killed during this period. So we can see in this color, this is the predominant religion of these areas at the time were Christian, even up into Rome. And I'll explain that in a moment. All of these regions, we see Alexandria, are Christian. We see very open, this is kind of the battlegrounds of the Christian faith. Now, for my history buffs out there, south of Rome was what? Who presided south of Rome? Well, south of Rome is where the military lived. And the military becomes, over that 300 years, predominantly Christian, and we see eventually one of the very first saints is a Roman general who refuses to kill Christians, actually turns around, and his unit ends up protecting them. But the Roman army, for the most part, is quite Slavic, as it were. They're not allowed into the city. They're kind of secondhand citizens. It's a very brutal thing. And what they find is the Roman army, we're kind of going a little bit off topic here, but what the Roman army finds is when they come out here to enforce things, the ones that actually bring them in, welcome them in, give them a bed to sleep, feed them, are the Christians. And everyone else is throwing stuff at them and ridiculing them, even when they go back to Rome. And so by Constantine, one of the reasons Constantine finally says, okay, let's be Christian, is because the army at that time could have easily taken him over. The army had already kind of swayed. So Constantine says, before kind of a major battle, the conversion of Constantine in 300, there was a kind of an east-west split. Constantine is the Roman emperor of the west. There's another emperor kind of that has risen to power in the east, and there's a battle between them. Maxentus, who's in the east, and Constantine, who's in the west. And before, now some people say this is legend. I personally believe he says this because he knows his army is Christian, secretively. So he goes to his army and he says, I've seen this wonderful thing in the sky. And it was a cross and kind of a P, and amazingly it spells Jesus Christ. And it said to use this sign to conquer. And his army said, okay, we'll do it. And they go. And so Constantine goes back and he says, I saw this sign of Jesus Christ, and he said, I'm supposed to be the one. Well, my personal opinion is Constantine wasn't a stupid man. And he knew his armies had become Christian, even his own mother had become Christian, and it was time. He couldn't stop it any further. And so he uses it to advance his cause, and it works. It works. He squashes the rebellion in the east, he reunites the Roman Empire, and so we go forth. Now, 325, about 25 years later, he officially makes it the official religion of Rome. So we have about 25 years where it's legal, but not the official religion. Now, at 325, you see all of this that's in green, all the way even up into Britain, France, Augsburg, that's important for us Lutherans. All of a sudden they stand up and they say, actually, we're Christian. That doesn't happen in a day, right? That doesn't happen in a day. All of a sudden, the church had been moving through this very difficult time, and once it becomes legal, they stand up and they say, here we are. Now, why is all of this important? It kind of goes back to our Lent 101, when we talked about why the public fast. why this celebration in a sense, a weird celebration in the sense that we're going to put ashes on our forehead and fast in unity, but why? Because for 300 years, they weren't allowed to do anything. The pagans could do whatever they wanted, right? The Jews, even at that time, even though they were kind of pushed out of Jerusalem, they could still kind of do whatever they wanted. But the Christians were not allowed to do what they wanted for a couple of reasons. One, before Christianity, religion was really a birthright. If you were born into this religion, it's what you were. Doesn't matter. You're a pagan, you're a pagan. You're a Jew, you're a Jew. You're a Roman, you're a Roman. Christianity came, and Paul said, that's not true. God never said that. And so for the first time, everyone could become a Christian. And they could talk to God, and they could find this inner feeling that they didn't have ever before. So Christianity booms, right? All of a sudden, the whole half of the world stands up and says, actually, we're Christian. And we find ourselves in a very weird place. And the church really starts from there. Because now, all of a sudden, we can have what? Buildings and churches, and we can do lots of things that we haven't done before. So one of the things the atheist will always say, and I hear this all the time, is they'll say, well, why is it that the very first church isn't even built until almost 300 years after Christ? Again, because it was illegal to be a Christian, right? This makes sense. Or they'll say, well, we don't really know where Christ was crucified or born or where he lived because it was 300 years difference. Well, I assure you that we know where there's an orchard somewhere, cherry trees in the Northeast where George Washington grew up. We know where that is, right? It was about that long ago. We know where that is. We haven't forgotten that. So I'm pretty sure the Christians could have maintained the very sites that were known, and in the writings, it's kept pretty historically accurate. For one, Jerusalem hadn't changed that much. You can still walk down the very same streets that he led with the cross. That's one. There's some other major things too, like the cave in which Mary gives birth to Christ is an important place because that is King David's birthplace as well, not in that cave, but the city of Bethlehem. And so it was very well known and protected by the Jews even at that point. The upper room we know is very much secure because below it is the tomb of King David, so we're not going to forget where the upper room is. So all these people will try to tell you, well, look, there's a 300-year period, and they'll tell you, the Gospels weren't even written for 200 years. That's not true. That's just not true. And they'll say, well, why don't we have record of it? Because it was illegal to have it, right? It's very simple. Now, letters from Paul were not illegal to possess, and so you could rewrite the letters of Paul. Those are a little bit different, right? So we see those kind of before. But some people will say, well, look, even if we look at Mark, why is Mark written later? Well, we know why Mark's written later. It's kind of the Gospel of Peter. Peter is about to be on his way out. He transcribes this thing orally. Mark writes it with him, writes it for him. So these are not things that should stumble you up in your faith. But people will use them to stumble you in your faith if you don't truly understand the history of the church or understand the period of time which follows the resurrection and until Constantine makes Christianity the full religion. So before we go to some of the first buildings, I want to touch on some of the very first Christians that we find. So Christians, now this is a very unique situation because Jesus says, right, you don't have to be a Jew to be a Christian. Now some of the first Christians, after Jesus is even gone, say, well, how do we do this? Should they become a Jew first and then they're a Christian? There's this rift. And so we find ourselves with three different factions of Christianity in the very early church. Past beginning in the apostolic and through that first kind of couple hundred years before they could kind of fully organize, we find three major factions. And the three major factions, for the most part, are the Jewish Christian movement. Now, the Jewish Christian movement is the disciples for the most part. They were all Jews. For the most part, with the exception of Thomas, go and they disciple to mostly Jews. So they know. That's what they do. Some of them go further north of the Baltic Seas, but for the most part, that's where they go. Now, Paul doesn't. Paul goes right around to the Gentiles. He goes all the way up, at least into France that we know. Some people say he goes up into Britain, but we know definitely into France. And if we look at this map, it would make sense that he gets up here, because we definitely see, as soon as it becomes Christian, we see pockets of Christianity. But we know for sure that he gets up into France. So you have the Jewish Christian movement first. They're the disciples. Now they are really they fled to Galilee initially, and they're under initially they're under James. Because Peter, even though he's given this idea of you're the rock of the church, Peter initially doesn't want it. Peter is Peter, right? He's going to stand up eventually, and he's going to form the initial Jerusalem, and then when Paul comes, he's going to go up to Antioch, and then he's going to go eventually over towards Rome. But initially James, the brother of Christ, is the one that initially takes charge of the disciples, the people who flee back to Galilee. And so that's the Jewish Christian movement. That's the first faction of the very early Christians. Now, the Jewish Christian movement, they were organized in synagogues. They worshipped. They still initially did some of the initial sacrifices until Paul said, you got to cut that out. We don't do that anymore. They still find themselves in this weird predicament of, I'm a practicing Jew, but I believe and I know the resurrection of the Lord. The reason we have this weird transition period is because, why? Well, at this time, there's still Saul. It's not Paul. And Saul is hunting these Jewish Christian movement down. He gets his conversion, but after the conversion, what happens with Paul? Well, Paul's gone for a period of time, almost 3 years in the desert, learning from Christ and preparing for his ministry. And so there's this period of this Jewish Christian movement. Now, it doesn't mean that Christianity is not growing. It is, like wildfire. But, again, you don't have the person that Paul was, who had the Pharisee educational background to be able to articulate this, write this, and to explain theology in a sense. And so some of the disciples do the best they can. They're telling about Jesus, and they're continuing their Jewish religion. Because again, we're the completion of the Jewish faith. Now, the second group of Christians that you'll find is what's called the Pauline Christians. Pauline Christians is Corinth, Ephesus, some of these other the pagans or the Gentiles that become Christians. Pauline because they follow Paul in a sense. Pauline Christianity eventually will absorb the Jewish Christian movement. They'll eventually absorb them. But the Pauline Christians, you read stuff about them, you have Paul's the main player, but you have people like Apollo that you read about in some of the different epistles, and some of these other speakers that are going in, the early clergy, and they are defining Christianity in these places. They're building up churches in these different cities. The Pauline Christians are quite different. So Saul, a Jew from Tarsus, like we said, who originally persecuted Jewish Christians on behalf of mostly the priests in Jerusalem, which is this odd conundrum. But like you said, he experienced a powerful conversion. He goes away for 3 years. He changes his name to Paul, and then he pushes out into his Christian ministry. So Paul is different because for the first time, Paul starts to claim other things as his own. And then we're going to see that I'm going to circle back to that in a minute. He starts to claim things as his own as far as the Jewish religion. He says, no, it's not Jewish anymore. Christianity is the completion of the Jewish faith. It's now Christian. And so he stands on the mountain of, all of you Jews are Christians, you just don't know it. You need to turn. Sounds a lot like Luther, in his later years. All of you Jews are actually Christians, you just don't know it. You need to turn your head. And so this is where Paul goes. Now Paul pushes on through Eastern Mediterranean. He attracts a lot of a lot of Gentiles, non-Jews, and he opens the faith up that way. Now the third were what's called the Gnostic Christians. And this is important because the Gnostic Christians are still creeping around today. The Gnostic Christian, you might hear them under a different guise of the Universalism church or the Unilateralism church or the ELCA, even at this point, I would say is the Gnostic Christians. Now the Gnostic Christians say, we're not sure if Jesus is God, but we know he was awesome because he kind of got the Romans off our back. We're not completely sure that the Jews are right. We're not completely sure that we don't like all these pagan things that's going on. Some of these orgy things are great. We want to keep that. And so the Gnostic Christians, they're kind of all over the place. They hone in eventually more in a Christian way, but the Gnostics start to kind of push for different things other than an individual relationship with Christ. The Gnostics really start to be petulant in the sense of almost pushing more for social justice more than a religious change or movement. It's a physiological and religious movement with the roots in pre-Christian times. Gnostics combine elements taken from Asia, Babylon, Egypt, Greek, the Syrian pagan religions, astrology, and Judaism and Christianity. Among Gnostic Christians, there were communities under the name of John and Thomas, but they were not the John and Thomas that we think of in the Christian faith. They claimed to have secret knowledge about God and humanity and the rest of the universe that the general population was unaware of. Only they had it. And if you came to them, a lot of times if you gave them money, we'll give you some of this information. Very much like the Church of Scientology today. We have a secret, only we have it. You can buy your way to this secret, but that's the only way we're going to give it to you. The Gnostics did a lot of those things. They had novel interpretations of the Bible, the world, and the rest of the universe. They believed that there was that God was a God, but he was. Gnostic Christians would say, actually, we are monotheistic. We believe in one God, but we think that he's the only God that has allowed himself to be seen by us. There may be other gods. Sounds a lot like universalism today. They had a belief that the Jehovah of the Hebrew scriptures, the old scriptures, was defective, that it was inferior, created, and also known as the Demiurge. They believed that the Old Testament God was an evil, jealous, bad God. You'll hear that a lot, unfortunately, in ELCA today, that the Old Testament God is just an evil, jealous God, and we don't believe that. But those maybe aren't inspired. Well, it is inspired. He is jealous. He's not evil. He's jealous for you, and he will destroy stuff for you, which to me is pretty cool. That he's that jealous of me that he's going to blow some stuff up for me. Pretty neat thing. I like it. All I got to do is follow him. Their tolerance of different religious beliefs within and outside Gnosticism, they believed in tolerance to the pagans, tolerance to the Romans, tolerance. So that's kind of the Gnostics. Now, we start to see eventually, if we go back quickly, and we've got a little time, but not too much. I don't want to push too much information. So between this period right here, a few decades, we see the church start to organize. The Pauline Christians, once we kind of step up, they eventually take on the Jewish Christian movement and kind of take them on. And the Pauline Christians eventually become, on the Roman side, what we know as eventually the Roman Catholic Church. And so they order themselves that way. And then what happens, though, is eventually the Roman government gets fed up because they said, hey, we're trying to say you guys are the legitimate religion of Rome, but you can't get your act together. So what is it? And so they have this Council of Nicaea where they invite all the big players at the time, all the theological minds, all the people who are kind of the head players in the Christian faith. They all come to the Council of Nicaea, and I'm kind of simplifying this a little bit, but stay with me. They go to the Council of Nicaea and they create what is the most famous thing that comes out of the Council of Nicaea? The Nicene Creed, right? They create the Nicene Creed and they go back to Rome and they say, here's the Nicene Creed. If anyone is outside of this, then they're not Christian. If they don't believe these tenets, then they're not Christian. And the Gnostics get very upset about this, but that's because the Gnostics are outside of this, right? And the Gnostics at this point start to phase out. We'll see them kind of back and forth through history. But at that point, we really have our first pillar kind of organized of the church. So people will say, well, the church really starts 300 years later. Again, that is not an argument against Christianity. That's an argument for Christianity. You're telling me that a religion or a belief or a faith lived for 300 years under the harshest of ways, being fed to lions, being tortured, being killed, being burned, being crucified. Nero said every Christian needs to be ripped apart by dogs or nailed to a cross. And that was the edict that he pushes out. But for 300 years, the faith doesn't die. It multiplies on a level like we've never seen anywhere else, right? So, again, what you're going to hear as we do apologetics is defending the faith. What you're going to hear from atheists or even some liberal, I don't want to call them Christians, it's difficult to call them that, so-called believers, or these people who will come at you and debate these things with you. The truth is that they don't have a true understanding of history or archaeology. They've never been there, they don't know. And so they use these things against you, but unless you know, it's difficult to rebuke them. They'll say, oh, well, you know, the Bible wasn't this, or there wasn't even a Christian church for 300 years after Christ. Well, obviously there wasn't, right? For a couple of reasons. Number one, the Jewish Christian movement met in synagogues. Paul, for the most part, does meet in some houses, also in synagogues, and he's moving from place to place. The Pauline Christians are standing up. Now, after that, we're going to get a little bit into the very early apostolic church, but I want to just move this on. This is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, but I want to talk a little bit about the apostolic church. To get into the apostolic church was an ordeal. Past the apostolic church into the early church was not an easy thing. Sometimes it took up to 3 years of being a catechumene, up to 3 years before the church would finally let you come in. Now, there's reasons for that. Number one, they wanted to make sure that you weren't trying to take this and go distort it, or you weren't taking it back, and so you would bring an agent in to kill us all or something like that. So before you could actually come into where they were meeting and when they were meeting and how they were meeting and be provided the Lord's Supper, it took many, many years of watching you and studying and seeing if you had the time. Are you fasting? Just think about kind of our Lenten journey for 3 years to prove that you're worthy to enter into the church. Now, people will say, well, that's not very Christian of you. But it doesn't mean that they didn't provide salvation. Anyone that wanted salvation, yes, they went, they baptized, they loved. But in order to be a part of the church, remember the church is the body of Christ, us, not the buildings. To be invited into the body of the church, it took many, many years sometimes before you'd be invited in. And then when you were, it was a little bit different for the most part. Typically, you would go in on the Easter Vigil, the night before Easter, and you would strip naked. And you would go in and you would be baptized again, this time with water, milk, and honey. It's a little bit different. We'll get into that another time. But those three elements, and then you would come back out and you would be able to have the Lord's Supper on Easter and celebrate Easter. But it was this huge thing. You'd be wrapped in white robe afterwards to show that you were a new person, and you would go in like Adam. It was very different in the sense of This was an underground, very, it was a dangerous thing. It was a difficult, dangerous thing. Of all of the things to blow up, this would not have been the one. You want to be a Christian? Every government's trying to kill you. Not kill you, but rip you apart. And two, it's going to be painstaking to become one. Most people would say, I'm good. You're telling me I got to give up all this stuff? Sexual impurity, and I got to start doing stuff right, and I got to do all these things? I'm okay. But the church booms under that. So again, I go back to a little bit of when people want to tell us or New Hope, even parts of the Lutheran Church, well, the church has moved past liturgy. The church has moved past pastors wearing albs, or the church has moved past this, or the church has moved past that. That's not true. People want structure, and they want the liturgy, and they want an interaction with the mystery of Christ. When the church boomed the most, I think, was at the height of the mystery, and the height of the ritual, and the height of coming before God and understanding. So I would kind of steer away from that. Okay, so we're 300 years in. The church is starting to build churches, finally. Actually, Caesar's mom, that makes it legal, she is sent with lots and lots of Roman money to go back and reestablish the Christian religious artifacts and places around Israel, even further than Israel. But she goes with all these soldiers and all this money to talk to people and investigate and say, is this the historical place? Is this this? Is this? And Rome, from that point on, becomes the Byzantine Empire, and they protect those sites. So these Christian sites have been protected from that point forward. They've been protected. We know exactly where they were. So people can say, well, they could have been forgotten in that 300 years. But I'll remind you again, like, if you go to Jerusalem, and many of you have been there with me, when she went back to Jerusalem and said, okay, where did Jesus walk from? The Christians didn't have any money. Remember, Jerusalem was a Christian city for those amount of times. They didn't have any money. They weren't building anything or changing anything. They said, well, that's still the Roman palace over there. And so he obviously walked here. That's still Golgotha, right? These things were not difficult to decipher. So one of the things people will argue with, specifically me, other people, when we go to Nazareth, they'll say, well, how do we know this was Jesus' birthplace, or not birthplace, but childhood home? How do we know? It was an archaeological dig, so we know that it's a carpenter shop. Down the hill is the house. It was about 324, I think I can't remember exactly, 324 is when the church said, this is a holy place, sacred from now on. So I'm pretty sure within those 300 years, they remembered. They probably was still in Joseph's family. They knew, right? This is kind of, Chris, how many things do you tell me about stuff around here that's 200 years old? A lot, right? We still know our history. 100 years old, 150, 200 years old. So they knew. And then two, the other thing is, we have gone and excavated Nazareth by this point, right? That's the carpenter shop. There wasn't more than one carpenter shop. It was a little town. So this is a carpenter shop in Nazareth. We have Roman writings that say he's the son of a carpenter from Nazareth. It doesn't take much to put them together. This is the childhood home of Jesus. You don't have to believe he's God to understand that this is the childhood home of Jesus. The same for Bethlehem, the same from there. These were important places. The very first place that the Christians really make holy is that top of Golgotha, Calvary. They go and they continue to go up there. That becomes a very holy site. The Church of Holy Sepulchre is eventually built down the hill. Eventually it's built over the hill. Now it encompasses kind of the whole thing. But this is important. This is what people call the very first Christian churches in Bethlehem. They say that because Caesar's mom with the first bits of money, builds a church here at the Nativity site. She builds a church here. And you can see through the years, this is the door that you go in, and you have to stoop down to go in it. And again, they call it the humble door opening. You have to be humble to get in it. You have to stoop down. But then you can see the years that it's been built up by different groups. The Crusaders would come and build. They would be knocked out. The Crusaders would come back and build. And then the church built, and the Roman church built. And it gets built up and built up and built up. But in here is the kind of the very first structural Christian church. And right inside this door, about 100 feet, is the cave. You still have to go down into the cave where Jesus is born. These places exist. We can see them. We can go to them. We can touch them. When people try to tell you that this is some kind of big mystery, it's not. It's not. It's right there for you to touch and feel. The Apostolic Church is still, again, I said this a couple of weeks ago, but in the Army, Pastor Brunkel agreed with me and everyone else in the military, we learn the lessons because they were learned in blood, right? In the Army, that's what they say. Why do we do this? Because we learned this lesson in blood. Meaning someone died and we said, we do it different now. We don't want to die. But as Christians, we need to remember the apostolic and early Christian period. We need to remember things like Lent and why they're so important to us, because people literally died for us to be able to do this. And then in 325, they stood up and they said, we want a day where everyone can see us fast and put ashes on our head. We want this. And the Pauline Christians turning into the early Christians. Another thing that you're going to hear, and we're going to go to a couple more pictures, but before we finish, another thing you're going to hear is, well, you know, Christmas is actually winter solstice. It's a pagan holiday. Yes, of course it is. We know that. That's not a secret. We're not saying Jesus was born on that day. What Christians said was, for 300 years, he murdered us and crucified us. We're the predominant group. Winter solstice is not Christmas. We celebrate the birth of our Lord on this day, right? And they went over here and they say, well, there's these periods and these periods. Yes, the church reclaimed those dates. They did. That's not a secret. But people will tell you, well, did you know that Christmas is actually this? Yeah, absolutely it is. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just because the winter solstice was held on this day that we now celebrate Christmas does not mean Christ was never born. It just means the Christians said, this is the day in which we're going to celebrate it. Why? For a couple of different reasons. Initially, the Christ Mass that we celebrate when we come in here and we have the candles lit and we come in dark, because the winter solstice was an epic pagan party. Make Mardi Gras look very faint. It was debauchery, and it was over the top winter solstice. And the Christians would get away from that, and they would come and they would huddle together in candlelight, and they would remember the birth of the Christ, or the giving of the Messiah, the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies. And they would hold this Mass, right? Started called the Christ Mass. The Christians would get away from everything. They would tuck themselves in. They would get away from it. And so when they were in charge, the Christians said, well, guess what? There's no winter solstice anymore. It's Christmas. Now it's Christmas. And so that's just historical things as it happens. July 4th, before July 4th in America, wasn't a thing. It doesn't mean Independence Day didn't happen, right? So when people say, well, you celebrate July 4th, did you know the Native Americans didn't celebrate July 4th? Of course not. Didn't happen yet, right? And so when people say, well, did you know December 25th was actually the winter solstice? That has nothing to do with the birth of Christ or us celebrating Christ on December 25th. This is what happened. So the Christians suffered and paid for hundreds of years for us to be able to worship. And we get to worship in most places in the world openly and outwardly, and so we should remember what they went through so that we can worship, right? So here's kind of the first church. It's been built way up on. the second church that we believe, the second church in Christendom, is here in Capernaum. Capernaum being the town of Jesus. You remember the synagogue in Capernaum is where the majority of the red letters in the Bible is said. So the majority of the things Jesus says in the Gospels that we read was done about 200 yards or 100 yards from here in the synagogue. The synagogue was across the way, so the Jews kick them out, get out, and so they go back. Remember, this was built, many of you may remember, this was built on Peter's house. So Peter was gone, Peter had left at this point, and the Christians, obviously, I don't know if Peter said, go ahead. I don't know if he wrote them out a deed. I don't know how it happened, but they turned Peter's house. They said, we got this little piece of land over here. Peter's not using it. Let's build a church. So they build a church. The church is now underneath this church. This is a church that's built on top of it. It's pretty neat. In the middle of it, there's glass on the floor. You can look down in the old remains of the church. It's built in an octagon because the very first churches were a place of learning and talking and debate. They would sit and they would talk and discuss, and everyone would look inward towards whatever scripture they had or whatever was being depicted of Christ. Built in this octagon, and this church still today is built in an octagon, but it's right across the way from the synagogue. Now the synagogue sees them build this church, and I've shown you some of these pictures. I don't have it today, I wish I would. But the Jews see this, and so they tear down that synagogue, and they build this big, beautiful synagogue right next to this church, kind of this competing. It's the very first kind of First Baptist, First Presbyterian fight we ever had, right? Right here in Capernaum. Right here in Capernaum. But this would have been what we think of as the second structural church in all of Christendom. People will often say, why not Rome? Well, Rome doesn't actually begin building a building until Mom gets back from starting all of these things. When Mom gets back, then they start building. So this is really the second one that we know of that starts to be built. It's pretty neat. This is a look down below. You can see this would have been the sanctuary area back here, and then they set in these little columns in this octagon kind of formation. But we don't have time. This is the Church of Holy Sepulchre. We say it's the holiest place in Christendom. It's the place of the crucifixion of our Lord. There's a lot that I could talk about this church forever. Those of you who've been to Jerusalem with me are probably holding their breath that I don't right now. There's just so much here. You have one of the Crusader kings is buried right here underneath some planks of wood. Right at the base of the stairs is where Jesus is stripped naked, and this is where he descends up the Mount of Calvary. About up here is where he's crucified. Down over here is where they lay his body to prepare him for burial. There's so much going on in this church. It's a beautiful, it's awe-inspiring. This place was not forgotten by the Christians. They knew exactly where they were, to the point where we still know where they laid the body of Christ. This was important. And remember, Jerusalem, once the temple is destroyed and they kick the Jews out, is a Christian city from that point forward. So anyone who tells you these would have all been forgotten, that's not true. The other thing that you're going to hear, and I'm going to have to finish on this, they'll tell you, well, all of these things would have been destroyed in the Crusades. When the jihadists came and captured the city, they would have destroyed it. Again, they don't know their religious history. In Islam, Muslims hold King David very sacred. Jesus, very sacred. They are imams in the Muslim religion, just as Muhammad. So when they came and captured Jerusalem, they were not going to destroy King David's tomb. They weren't going to destroy the things that were important to Jesus because they were important figures. They were not Muhammad or Allah, obviously, but they were important figures. So what they would do is kind of build on them. You'll see specifically in the upper room, you'll see kind of Jewish stuff, and you'll see Christian stuff, then you'll see where they put a mosque over here in the corner, then the Christians came back, and they may have changed it back into Christianity, and then the jihadists came and they put it back into a mosque, but the area is preserved. It's preserved. So from the point that it starts all the way through, these landmarks were special and important to the people who were there, all the way through. So the things that you hear people say attacking your faith or your religion are patently untrue, just uneducated, or they don't know what they're talking about. But they can get away with it because no one really knows anymore. So they say, do you know you didn't even have a church for 300 years? Did you know that this would have been destroyed? That we wouldn't have been able to remember this? Do you know that this would? None of that is true. You can see it, you can read it, you can read in Roman historical writings, you can find this stuff, right? This isn't difficult if you look a little bit into it. So this is the Church of Holy Sepulchre. It's built on the mountain of the skull, hill of the skull. This is right next to the site of the crucifixion. You can still see the hill, Golgotha, the stone hill that's kind of preserved under glass. You can see more of it as you go down. But what's unique to this one is this is, I believe the legend, but legend says that when the earthquake happens after the death, this is part of the earthquake. That's pretty neat to see. It's right next to where the cross was. And this, as you come down, is not only our local chipmunk, Nicole, but also this is the part of the hill where Jesus' body was laid, according to tradition, when they prepared it for baptism. These places were very important to the early Christians. And when people want to say things like, well, we don't know where these places are, remember these Christians were willing to go and be murdered and ripped to shreds by lions. You're going to tell me they don't keep a record of where these things were? They were willing to be crucified upside down. They would be taken out on a cross into the surf, into the ocean, and they'd be nailed to a cross, and so that the surf would come in and drown them. And they were willing to do that. You're going to tell me they wouldn't keep a record and know these things are important and sacred to them? Of course they did. Of course they did. That's easy. Anyone with common sense would understand that. So we're trying to get an understanding of who the early Christians were, the three sects of the early Christians, why buildings weren't built until a certain point, why we see some books come later into population, for a couple reasons. One, we don't have monks to rewrite them until Anthony of Egypt, and that was in 251. And the second reason is because to have those Christian writings were illegal. And so when people say we don't see historical reproductions of the Gospels for 250 years, they didn't have computers, and they didn't have printers. And so until there was a means in which to reproduce them, that would have been difficult, right? But they say these things to plant seeds of doubt in you. Don't let it happen. They say things like, well, your religion is only 2,000 years old. That's not true at all. Our religion is the oldest religion in the world, with the completion of the Jewish faith. So don't let them say these things to you. Don't let them put these seeds of doubt into you. If you have any questions on the first